Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to another Ref Brandon and the Todd Family YouTube video. Wherever you are, whatever you may be doing, thank you so much for making Ref Brandon and the Todd Family a part of your day. We always greatly appreciate it. It's a Wednesday, so it's time for another Top 10 Countdown. I'm looking forward to this one. Now, if you're a long-time follower of the channel and you've been with us from pretty much since day one, then you may recognize some of the names that I'm going to mention on this week's Top 10 Countdown. But I promise you, it's a different video because the last time I mentioned some of these names, it was not a Top 10 Countdown. I even remember in the video saying that it was not a Top 10 Countdown. It was just everybody that knows me personally knows my one passion is wrestling. I love wrestling. And somebody had asked me, I forget now who it was, but somebody had asked me to just do a video talking about some of my favorite all-time gimmicks in the world of wrestling. Whether they were good or bad, just ones that I remember in all my years of watching wrestling. So I did. But that was probably back in March or April of last year. So I figured it's time to come on here and actually do a video about it. So today's video is just going to be Top 10 all-time worst wrestling gimmicks. Now, if you're a long-time wrestling follower, you've probably heard all of these names. And if you're a wrestling historian, you've probably heard all these names. But some of these gimmicks just did not last very long. So there's a chance that you've just totally forgot about it. And I'm going to bring it back to your memory by talking about it. If you've heard of any of them, please feel free to let me know. If you remember seeing any of them when they started, please feel free to let me know. This is actually something that I miss about wrestling. I know I'm going to talk about some of the worst all-time gimmicks, but just in general, I just miss the days of wrestlers having gimmicks. Nowadays, 95% of wrestlers, they act robotic. They do the same moves at the same time in every match they're in. Probably half the wrestlers now use their real names. You just don't hardly ever see anybody get a true gimmick anymore. So I miss the days of these gimmicks. Whether they work or not, I just like trying them instead of seeing the same old thing all the time. Number 10 on the list was Max Moon. Now, Max Moon was actually originally portrayed by the man who later became famous as Conan. But this gimmick started back in 1992, so we're talking about 30 years ago. And back then, Conan weighed 200 pounds maybe. If you have not seen this gimmick or don't remember seeing the gimmick, I encourage you to go back and watch some of the stuff because it's amazing how good Conan was in the ring back in those days. And the gimmick may have actually worked, but not long after Conan started the gimmick because it was his idea, and he got a suit fitted just for him. He actually had a falling out due to contract negotiations and left the company. But since they had already started the gimmick, they had to find somebody else to do it. So they had to find somebody else that was about the same size as Conan to put on the outfit and wear it. But it looked like an astronaut. He came to the ring with these small little packets on both wrists that he would shoot off, and they shot off something that looked like fireworks and confetti mixed together. And then he had this jetpack on his back that supposedly could lift him to the ring in the air, but yet he never used it, so we don't know. But the whole idea was just flat out terrible. But if you go back and watch how good Conan was in the ring back then, I believe the gimmick would have actually worked, but not because of the gimmick. It was because of how good Conan was in the ring. But I believe him leaving the company was pretty much the sign of the end for that gimmick. Number 9 was the Goon. The Goon was supposed to be a hockey player, and the NHL was on strike. So this guy decided, hey, I want to stay active. I'm going to be a wrestler. So he showed up wearing a hockey outfit and carrying around a hockey stick, and the whole thing was just flat out stupid. Number 8 was a gimmick named Fantasio. Now, Fantasio was played by a man named Harry Del Rios. And if I'm not mistaken, Harry Del Rios is actually still active on the independent circuit to this day. But he actually used the Fantasio gimmick in other wrestling companies that was not called Fantasio, but it was the same gimmick. But his finish was supposed to be him being a wrestling magician would magically remove the underwear of the guy he's wrestling, and then when the guy he's wrestling realizes his underwear is gone, he goes into shock. Oh no, I have no underwear! And Fantasio rolls him up and pins him 1, 2, 3. The gimmick was so bad it lasted one episode of, I believe, WWF Superstars, and it got pulled from TV because, first of all, if you take off somebody's underwear, they're going to know it. But second of all, you have gear on. You're not naked. So why would you freak out like you're in the ring but naked when you're not? It was just flat out terrible. But number 7 was Mantar. Now, Mantar was portrayed by a man named Mike Halleck. And it was supposed to be half man, half bison. So you had this 400-pound man walking to the ring wearing this bison outfit. But it was just a really, 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 really hairy outfit. But he had a hood on, and the hood had horns coming out of it. So, of course, you can't wrestle in that. So he gets to the ring, and that comes off. Well, then he's just a really fat, hairy man. So the whole thing was just flat out awful. But it was supposed to be half man, half bison. Number 6 on the list was Arachna Man. And if you can't tell by the name Arachna Man, yes, it was pretty much a Spider-Man ripoff. And it was portrayed by Brad Armstrong. And if the name Armstrong sounds familiar, yes, he's one of the sons of the late, great Bullet Bob Armstrong. And in my personal opinion, Brad was the best wrestler of the family. But Arachna Man was a WCW ripoff of Spider-Man. And it looked exactly like Spider-Man, except for the outfit was yellow. So within a couple of months, the creators of Spider-Man called WCW and said, hey, this is gimmick infringement. You've got to get that man off TV. So it didn't last, but it was just flat out awful. They should have known from the get-go that the Spider-Man creators are not going to let you have a character that is the same exact thing as Spider-Man, just different color costume. Before we crack the top 5, let's recap numbers 10 through 6. Number 10, Max Moon. Number 9, The Goon. Number 8, Fantasio. Number 7, Mantar. And number 6, Arachna Man. Now, number 5 was a gimmick that was actually portrayed by a tag team. And this is back in the day. Now it's called Impact. But before that, it was called TNA Impact. Before that, it was called TNA. Before that, when it first started, it was called NWA TNA. And when it first started, they had this tag team called the Johnsons. And if you're thinking the wrong thing, you'd be correct. It was 2 men that walked to the ring, and they looked just like they were 2 grown goobers walking around a wrestling ring. And it was just awful. And they were called the Johnsons. And it was terrible. And they later were in WWE as a tag team called Gemini. But the Johnsons was 2 grown goobers walking around a wrestling ring. Number 4 was Harry Beaver Cleavage. And if the name Beaver sounds familiar, it should, because yes, this character was a play off of Leave It to Beaver. And the guy that portrayed the gimmick was dressed just like the Beaver character from the 50s and 60s TV show. But it was one half of the tag team, the Headbangers, if you remember that tag team. One of them got hurt, and the other one wanted to continue wrestling, but since he had always been known as a tag team guy, they decided to repackage him and pretend like he's somebody different and let him keep wrestling. So Vince McMahon had this idea of, hey, leave it to Beaver. So he was dressed like the Beaver character, and he had cleavage in the name because he was supposed to be in love with his mama and had an infatuation with his mama, and he was always doing vignettes in supposedly his house, and his mama was on there with him, and she was always wearing these low-cut shirts with her cleavage hanging out. The only problem with the entire thing was the fact that his mama looked like she was 20 years old, maybe. So if you're going to do that and make it look like the guy is in love with his mama, she needs to at least look like she's older than he is, whereas his mama looked like she was younger than he was. It was just a terrible idea, and it was just awful from the get-go. Number 3 was TL Hopper. Now, the rumor is TL stood for toilet lid, but toilet lid Hopper was supposed to be a plumber, and he was having trouble finding a job as a plumber and finding enough jobs as a plumber to make a living that he was going to become a wrestler. And he would show up wearing what you would picture a plumber wearing, carrying a plunger. Back in the 90s, Vince McMahon had this bright idea that in order to make wrestlers popular, you've got to make it look like they've got everyday jobs and they either got fired or they're struggling to make ends meet, so they become wrestlers. But they don't just become wrestlers, they become wrestlers wearing the same clothes that they wore in their everyday job. So TL Hopper would show up carrying a plunger because he's a plumber. But if you ever watched that promotion that Jim Cornette had in the mid-90s called Smoky Mountain Wrestling, I believe they closed their doors in 96. They ran most of their shows in East Tennessee and Kentucky, since Jim Cornette is from Louisville, Kentucky. But he had a wrestler named Dirty White Boy. And Dirty White Boy actually finished number 25, I think, in the PWI countdown of the top 500 wrestlers in 1995. So Dirty White Boy was actually a really good wrestler, but that was the same guy that had the gimmick of TL Hopper. And he was a great wrestler, but when you're a plunger, there ain't but so much you can do in a wrestling ring. Number 2 on the countdown is the Shockmaster. Now, I will say the Shockmaster only is a bad gimmick because of what happened the night it debuted. Otherwise, it may have ended up being a great idea. But the Shockmaster was portrayed by the same man who was Typhoon and Tugboat in the WWF in the early to mid 90s. This idea was, I believe, a Dusty Rhodes idea, if I'm not mistaken. But the problem was Fred Ottman was the man's name, and he was 400 pounds plus, and they put this mask on him that had no way to see, no way to breathe. So the man couldn't see a darn thing. And the night he debuted, they had him walking through this huge, huge wall, and it had a door in it. And he couldn't see because of the costume. And the costume was so bad that Ole Anderson was supposed to stand backstage and talk and pretend like he was a Shockmaster, because the Shockmaster couldn't talk because the mask had no way to talk through. But anyway, on to finish the story. The night he debuted, he was supposed to walk through this wall, but they didn't tell him that they put an extra 2x4 at the bottom of the wall to make sure he didn't tear the whole wall down, because he was a good-sized big man. So he couldn't see that board because of the mask he had on. So as he's walking up to the door, the top of the door does not bust for whatever reason. It just didn't bust through the wall. And the bottom, he tripped over that 2x4 because he couldn't see it. So he fell through the door and about tore the wall down, and his mask came off. And you could immediately tell who it was. So it killed the gimmick immediately. And you could hear everybody in the background laughing. You can even hear Ole in the background getting ready to talk, laughing because of what just happened, because it was live. Unlike TV shows and movies, it ain't recorded, it's live. So everybody seen it live, so of course you can't hold back your laughter. But he tried to cover it up. He got back up and put the mask on, and then Ole started talking, but it was too late. It was dead, and he tried to make it big because of that. He's even sold some Shockmaster costumes since then and actually signed them. So he made the best of it. Not his fault. They just put that board up and didn't tell him, and he tripped over it. And when he tripped, he fell through the door and the mask came off, and that was it. Number 1 is the Yeti, or in the words of Tony Schiavone from back in the days of Nitro, the Yeti. And Tony Schiavone says he was not told to say it like that. He just thought it made the character sound even better. But the Yeti was supposed to be the new enforcer for the Dungeon of Doom back in the days of the Dungeon of Doom, if you recall them, with Kevin Sullivan and all those guys from back in the Monday Nitro days. But the only problem with the Yeti was he showed up and he's this 7-foot man, and they pretty much got him wearing this mummy costume. So he looks like he's walking around as a 7-foot man, and he's decked out in toilet paper. And the night he debuted, he was supposed to try to help the Dungeon of Doom take down Hulk Hogan. And when he debuted, Hulk Hogan was already in a bear hug. But of course it was from the front side. He was supposed to go from the back side and make it look like Hulk Hogan is in a double bear hug. But instead, he just throws his arms over Hogan's shoulders and doesn't put no weight in the middle of his body on Hogan. And he stands there and he's doing this. So it looks like he's dry humping Hulk Hogan. So it was just a terrible, pitiful, pathetic idea. So get on YouTube one day and type up the Yeti and see him behind Hulk Hogan doing this. And you'll see what I mean. It was just a terrible, terrible idea. Within 3 months, they had him repackaged as Big Ron Studd, as a play on Big John Studd, because the guy who portrayed the Yeti's first name was actually Ron. And then he came back later on as Reese because his last name was Reese. But it was just a terrible idea having a 7-foot man walk to the ring dressed in pretty much toilet paper. But if you recall the Dungeon of Doom in WCW, who was ran by Kevin Sullivan, then you'll remember about how long ago that was. But that is our top 10 countdown of top 10 all-time worst wrestling gimmicks. Now I'm going to name off a few that were also terrible, but not quite top 10 worthy. One was Bastion Booger, and one was Friar Ferguson. And the reason why I mentioned those two together is because they were both portrayed by the same man. The man's name is Mike Shaw. Now, Mike Shaw has actually been dead since 2010, I believe. I think he had a pulmonary embolism because of how big he was. But Friar Ferguson got pulled from TV because the Catholics didn't like it, because it pretty much looked like he was a priest gone bad. He also had another gimmick called Norman the Lunatic. But the Bastion Booger gimmick is the one that everybody knows the most, because it's the one that lasted the longest of those three and was the worst of those three. And supposedly this was all Vince McMahon's idea, because Mike Shaw was so big that Vince McMahon supposedly made fun of him because of his weight. So he wanted a gimmick that would just make him look bad and hopefully embarrass him to make him want to lose weight. So they had him wear this outfit that looked like something a Chippendales guy would wear, because he'd come out and it came straight down like this and wrapped around his stomach, so his whole stomach's hanging out. Both his man boobs are hanging out, and there was even times where Vince McMahon, if you're a long-time wrestling fan, you remember that back in the day, Vince McMahon was a commentator, and at one time he even interviewed wrestlers. He would interview the Bastion Booger, and Bastion Booger is standing there eating fried chicken while they're talking. So supposedly that whole gimmick was Vince McMahon's idea, trying to embarrass Mike Shaw to make him want to lose weight. But he would, in the ring, with his man boobs hanging out and his belly hanging out, it was just flat out terrible. And it was a gimmick called Bastion Booger. And then we have Duke the Dumpster Droso, just like I mentioned with T.L. Hopper. This was another Vince McMahon idea of making somebody's everyday job supposedly make them become a wrestler. And Duke the Dumpster Droso was supposed to be a trash man. And when he debuted, there was vignettes of him on the back of a trash truck picking up trash. Well, supposedly he wasn't making enough money, so he decided, hey, I'm going to become a wrestler. But becoming a wrestler wasn't enough. He had to be a wrestler, still wearing his trash truck outfit and walking around with a trash can lid and a trash can on his back. And then we had the artist formerly known as Prince Iaukea, and yes, it was a play on the singer Prince. So he originally was Prince Iaukea, then he became the artist formerly known as Prince Iaukea, and this was back in the days of the WCW, Nitro, and Thunder. He was mainly on Thunder, but he was actually a good wrestler. But when you have the name artist formerly known as Prince Iaukea, you're doomed from the get-go because everybody knows where your name came from. And then we also have Abe Knuckleball Schwartz. Now, Abe Knuckleball Schwartz, just like T.L. Hopper and Duke the Dumpster Droso, had an everyday job. His everyday job was supposed to be baseball. And this was in '94 when baseball had the strike, so he wanted to keep playing baseball, and since baseball was on strike, he was going to go be a wrestler, and he was going to dress in a baseball outfit. So he came to the ring with this big old baseball wrapped around his stomach, and he had a baseball in his hand. But Abe Knuckleball Schwartz was actually portrayed by Steve Lombardi, who was the same guy who was the Brooklyn Brawler for years. So you got to give the man credit, because a lot of people don't know that Brooklyn Brawler was a busy man, because back in the day, everybody knows him as Brooklyn Brawler. He's probably the most famous jobber in the history of wrestling. But at one time, Kamala had a manager named Kim Chi. And if you remember Kamala, just think about the guy that stood there with him with the black thing over his face. You couldn't see his face. Well, Kim Chi was Steve Lombardi. And then when Doink the Clown, the original creator of Doink the Clown, left the company, Steve Lombardi was Doink the Clown. And then Steve Lombardi was Abe Knuckleball Schwartz. And then Steve Lombardi was the Brooklyn Brawler. So there was a time where he showed up 4 times on Monday night in 4 different gimmicks. So that just tells you how good a shape he was in for years. So yes, even though he was known as the Brooklyn Brawler, he did several other things and did them all to perfection for a long time. But Abe Knuckleball Schwartz was supposed to be a baseball player, and baseball was on strike, so he just shows up in a baseball outfit to bring the diamond, which is what they call a baseball field, to wrestling, since baseball was on strike. I don't know why Vince McMahon had that idea back in the day that in order for a wrestler to get popular, they've got to have an everyday job. So you had the Goon, who played hockey. You had Duke the Dumpster Droso, who was a trash man. You had T.L. Hopper, who was supposed to be a plumber. And then you had Abe Knuckleball Schwartz, who's supposed to be a baseball player. And another terrible gimmick that was not quite top 10 worthy, but I'll mention this one because it's got a funny backstory behind it too. And that was the gobbledygooker. Now, the gobbledygooker didn't last long, but it was a man dressed in a turkey outfit. But the funny thing about the gobbledygooker is it debuted 1990 at Survivor Series, which just so happens to be the same night that Mark Calloway debuted as The Undertaker. Now, the funny thing about this is The Undertaker knew months in advance that he was going to debut the night of Survivor Series. But for the longest time, he didn't know what his gimmick was going to be. He just knew he was no longer going to be Mean Mark Callis, which was his name in WCW, but he didn't know what he was going to be. So he had talked to Vince about debuting that night, and that was all he knew for the longest time. And he was watching WWF, trying to get up to date with everything that was going on, so when he got there, he would know. And he started seeing these vignettes of the gobbledygooker. So he had convinced himself that he was going to be the gobbledygooker. So he says that he almost gave himself an ulcer sitting at home worrying about how he's going to debut as the gobbledygooker. And then finally one day Vince McMahon called him and said, "Is this the Undertaker?" And he paused for a second and said, "Oh, yes." And that's when he found out he was going to be the Undertaker and not the gobbledygooker. So get on YouTube and type up the gobbledygooker and picture the 6'10" Mark Calloway walking around in that costume. That would be hysterical. Any thoughts on the countdown, please feel free to let me know. Let's go ahead and get our dad joke of the day in here. What do you call a coupon-using vampire? A sucker for deals. And that wraps it up for today's Ref Brandon and the Todd Family YouTube video. Until next time, it's Ref Brandon saying, just like in pro wrestling, life can be over by the count of 3. Tell your friends and family how much you love them. Bye.